A warm welcome to Nicola Spence, who's our speaker for today's lunchtime lecture. And thank you, Nicola, for finding time for this. I'll introduce Nicola Spence and then hand it over to her, followed by a Q&A. Professor Nicola Spence is DEFRA's Chief Plant Health Officer, and she is an expert in plant health and international plant trade. Previously, she was the head of plant health and chief scientist at the Food and Environment Research Agency. She is an experienced research scientist and has worked on viral diseases of horticultural crops in the UK and internationally. She has a very long list of accomplishments, which I'm not going to read out in whole, but I will mention that she is a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology and the president of the British Society of Plant Pathology. And I'm not going to keep you any longer. Nicola, over to you.
Thanks very much, Padma, and it's a great pleasure to be talking to you all today. So as Padma explained, I'm the Chief Plant Health Officer for the UK. So my job is to assess threats to plants and trees, to advise ministers, stakeholders, and the public, and to take actions to protect our plants and trees. So the value at risk is enormous. Sorry, I'm just trying to progress the slides and it's not working. There we go. The value at risk is huge, and we've tried to monetize this in terms of the economic value of healthy crops and forestry, around 9 billion, the value to food and drink exports underpinned by plant health, about 20 billion, and then of course the wider environmental benefits, which are more difficult to monetize, but again, probably around at least another 20 billion. And that's probably an underestimate. And the asset value of trees, forests, and woodlands is huge. It's about 175 billion. So the value at risk is huge, and hence the rationale for government intervention and taking action. And since about 1970, this slide shows a number of pests and diseases of trees that have occurred in the UK. So you can see that the trajectory is that they are increasing, they're more frequent. And this is being driven by climate change, it's being driven by global trade in plants and plant products, and also people moving around the globe. So there is an upward trend and an increasing threat over the last 3 or 4 decades. And if there is an outbreak of a pest or disease, it can be extremely expensive. So here you can see the cost of an outbreak of Asian Longhorn beetle. This was a pest that was found in Kent in 2012. And we reckon it's cost about £2 million to be able to ultimately declare this eradicated, which we did last year. But that's nothing compared with the impacts in the USA, where it's hundreds of millions, plus the loss of trees and all the various kind of benefits that they have. And then if a disease becomes endemic, such as Ash Dieback and Phytophthora ramorum, then that can also be very costly. So it's been estimated that Ash Dieback may cost GB around 15 billion over the next 100 years. And often that's caused by, the impact that dangerous trees might have when they need to be felled. And then Phytophthora ramorum is an ongoing tree disease. It's been around really for the last more than 10 years. And that is having an ongoing impact because of the cost of felling and reducing its spread. So always better to keep pests and diseases out because if they establish, it becomes very expensive. So how do we organise the plant health service in the UK? Well, we have a plant health regime. It sits in government, but it sits under the umbrella of the World Trade Organization and the IPPC, which is the International Plant Protection Convention. This is one of the 3 sisters of the UN and the FAO, the OIE, and Codex being the other two on animal health and food. So that's the framework that we work with at a global legal level. And then within the UK, DEFRA is the National Plant Protection Organisation, the lead department. But plant health is devolved. So the governments of Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland also are involved in developing their own policy and legislation. But we coordinate things at a UK level. And then we have a range of organisations that deliver surveillance, inspection, control, diagnostics, and research, both in England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. So how do these pests and diseases arrive? Well, there are many different pathways, and this is the kind of typical pathway, plants for planting. So you can see here tree ferns that are potted up. We've got a trolley with lots of bedding plants that are being brought in. So these are subject to inspection regimes based on risk. But as you can see, if you've got a container full of these plants, it's actually very challenging to inspect everything. There is an increasing demand for mature plants and trees, such as these olives on a flatbed. These are very mature. They're probably hundreds of years old. They've got their whole ecosystem associated with those plants and the soil that they're in. This slide shows pre-EU exit trade. Things are much more tightly controlled now because of the risk that this plant has. And then there are also products such as mangoes and bitter gourd that you can see here, which can harbour invasive pests and diseases. These are non-European fruit flies and thrips, and we regularly intercept those in fresh produce. Wood and wood products can also be a threat. Wood's actually very well regulated, as are pallets. So pallets should be heat treated and stamped with the ISPN 15, which is an international standard of phytosanitary measures for all wood packaging material. But from time to time, we find other kinds of wood, like these Christmas wreaths in a garden centre. We don't quite know where they've come from. They've come outside the normal plant health controls. And that's the kind of thing that piques our interest and gets us interested in finding out where they're coming from and whether there's a risk. Machinery and vehicles and equipment can also represent a threat. There's actually a huge global trade in used vehicles, particularly farm vehicles. And again, there is an international standard whereby they should be cleaned before they're being moved. But we do occasionally intercept these pests. This is the brown marmorated stink bug. And whilst it's a plant pest, it also is a household nuisance, because if it gets into your home, it literally stinks the place out. So machinery and vehicles is something that, you know, we've been taking a much closer look at. And if a vehicle arrives and it's covered in soil and signs of infestation, then we will take action on it. Direct sales and postal services have increased enormously over the last decade or so, and that brings with it risk and indeed sometimes smuggling. The parcel on the left there has smuggled potatoes that are mixed in with some other kind of yam tubers. So these were seized in one of the parcel depots. And then on the right, we've got curry leaves there. There was a hot trade in fresh curry leaves. This has since been deregulated since we left the EU, because it doesn't really represent a risk to the UK. But it does to other parts of Europe. So these are two examples of products that we seize through a routine inspection of the postal depots and parcel depots. And then even household items can represent a risk. So you can see on the left there, this was a chair. It was bought on eBay, quite a kind of low value chair. And then the owners were a bit alarmed when one day a very large beetle popped out of the back and flew around their conservatory. So the plant health inspectors became involved, and when they dismantled this chair, sure enough, it was made of very poor quality wood with clear evidence of exit holes. That round hole you can see there, that's the exit hole from an Asian longhorn beetle. And then similar items like this cutlery tray also had evidence of infestation by an invasive pest. So these are the things that, you know, we're working hard with manufacturers to regulate, to make sure that the wood that is used qualifies under the international standard. And even larger furniture can be a problem. This was a headboard from a very reputable furniture supplier, but the owners of this headboard started hearing a kind of scratching noise when they went to bed at night, and they had no idea where it was coming from. They checked the loft, they checked the floorboards, they even thought that, you know, that the headboard might be haunted. So plant health got involved through the local authority sort of pest control, because it was a familiar story to us. And when we dismantled the headboard, we found evidence of Asian longhorn beetles. And you can see there the larvae. The larvae are several centimeters long. They take up to 4 years to complete their life cycle in the UK in something like a headboard. They'll munch their way through your furniture, and then one day they'll pop out and fly off and obviously try and invade a tree, which is where, you know, that's what we want to stop. So unfortunately that headboard was destroyed because it obviously had a clear risk. So again, working with furniture manufacturers so that they're asking questions about the source of wood. I mean, other types of wood are very strongly controlled for sustainability. So, you know, we're now trying to get biosecurity as to be part of that trade. And sometimes even these issues end up making the headlines, you know, where people have thought that they've got some kind of haunted furniture. And almost certainly it turns out to be Asian longhorn beetles. And actually, some of you who are regulars to the Linnean Society will probably realize exactly where that photograph was taken. It's in the courtyard outside Burlington House, backing onto the Royal Society. So, sorry, the Royal Academy. So one day I had a meeting at the Linnean Society, and I looked out and thought that looks like quite an interesting exhibition. It's an exhibition by the Chinese dissident artist Ai Weiwei. And of course, being a plant pathologist, I can't help but nosy around things like that. And my eagle eye spotted immediately exit holes all over this exhibit. So that began to ring alarm bells. Given this was December, the risk of any emerging because of the temperature were very low, but nevertheless, we got the forestry inspectors involved. They investigated the exhibit and spoke to the Royal Academy. And we had to issue them with a statutory plant health notice that we needed to take some action. And this is where it's quite a challenge deciding what is appropriate and proportionate action, given this is a work of art and, you know, quite politically sensitive. So we agreed that once the exhibition had finished, given the risk was low in December, we would take the exhibit apart and fumigate the whole thing to reduce the risk that there were any live beetles. So I'm pleased to say that that took place, and then the artwork continued on a tour. We felt it was important that we took action because we knew this exhibit was going to be moving around other parts of Europe. So a really important lesson that even works of art can be subject to plant health controls when they're made of plants and plant products. And then, you know, large consignments of steel often use low quality wood to pack them. So you can see here, this is a huge consignment of steel going into the north of England. There were tons and tons of it. And the wood that was used to pack that steel was very poor quality. It had bark, it had exit holes. So once the steel was unloaded, the whole lot of wood packaging had to be destroyed at the port. this was an enormous cost to the importer. There were several consignments, and the cost of destruction ended up being hundreds of thousands of pounds. So again, this sparked the trade in steel and those kind of manufactured goods to become much more aware of plant health regulations to avoid the cost and this kind of risk. And then even sports stadiums are not immune from plant health. Those of you who are football fans will recognise these sports stadiums in Manchester, Manchester United, Manchester City. And unfortunately, the turf became infested with a notifiable eelworm called Meloidigyne phallax. It's a nematode, and it's really an issue for horticultural and agricultural crops. It can infect things like carrots and celery and parsnips. So we work closely with the football clubs and indeed several other sporting venues to come up with safe biosecurity protocols. The issue was that they'd been bringing in sand from natural environments, and that's where we think the infection came from. Actually, garlic is very effective in treating nematodes. So I think they did use a garlic compound, a natural compound to spread on the turf to try and clear the nematodes, and then the whole thing was relayed. So that was, again, a different kind of challenge, different kinds of stakeholders. And then, of course, we love our gardens. We're very enthusiastic gardeners. In the UK, we estimate that there are 3 million more gardeners now than there were at the beginning of lockdown. Everyone has really appreciated and valued gardens and window boxes and plants in flats and houses. But of course, that drives trends in the desire for plants. This is Monty Don with a garden that he planted with olive trees. So that is a very high risk host for a disease called Xylella. Of course, when Monty plants an olive tree, then that creates a lot of demand. So we had a chat with the BBC producers afterwards, and thankfully Monty was really helpful. And on a subsequent programme, he talked about the risks of Xylella and the importance of buying from a reputable source. And then Gardener's Question Time, the panel here, they also have lots of questions from the public about what should I do when I bring back a plant from my holiday? And of course, the right answer is destroy it, because it may represent a risk. But of course, the public do like to trade plants and share plants and move plants around. So it's important that we all understand the risk of that. And then food trends as well drive new things appearing. So, this is a fantastic array of foods. And some of these appeared when MasterChef did Peru Week a couple of years ago. And of course, MasterChef's an incredibly popular television series encouraging people to cook. But when they started promoting the tuberous vegetable ulluco, which is shown right on the bottom of the slide in the middle, that rang real alarm bells with us. And then similarly on the left, you've got ochre there, because these tubers, they're grown in the Andes and Peru, but they do harbour harmful viruses. And when we discovered that these were being traded on the internet, we investigated and discovered indeed, that they were riddled with viruses, some new to science. So we took action, and now we have a strict import ban on these tubers, unfortunately, because they're simply too high a risk for us. Essentially, they risk our own potato crops and natural plants. And then some of you may recall last year, we had a bit of an incident all over the UK. People received these mysterious packets of seed. And so this shows some of the packages, some of the seeds. Literally thousands of people, not just in the UK, but all over the world, were receiving these packets of seed. So we investigated, we did a big social media campaign. We did quite a lot of national media to say, if you receive any of these seeds, please do not plant them, either destroy them, or better still, send them to the Animal and Plant Health Agency. So we will investigate them. So all in all, we received several thousand packets from the public, and the labs at Pheroscience did a lot of investigation. I mean, what we discovered was interesting. No biosecurity threat, just very poor quality seed of a whole range of different genera, sunflowers, and these look like citrus seed. So no real threat, no real explanation. Most of them were coming from China and Malaysia and Asia. But we put it down to something called a brushing scam, whereby internet sellers send low value packaging and products to people, and then they will write a review in your name saying what a fantastic online supplier that they are. So it's called a brushing scam. Thankfully, we haven't had a repeat this year because it really was quite a challenging time. And that's just a box of the seeds that one of our inspectors had in his house. He was collecting them and then sending them on to Phera. So how do we manage all these risks from all these different sources? Well, we've got a fantastic tool here in the UK called the Plant Health Risk Register. Essentially, it's a massive open database of all the risks globally that we think we need to consider. And the way in which it works is we give each pest risk a RAG rating, a red, amber, green rating, based on a quantitative measure of how likely is it to come here. If it did, what impact might it have? And what's the value at risk from that pest? Is it economic, social, environmental, or a bit of all three? So we give each pest a ranking and a rating out. Each of those quantitative measures is given a 5. So the maximum score the pest risk can have is 125. And then we RAG rate it based on the highest risks being red, the medium risks, amber and green, and so on. So for example, this shows 2 pests, Alurocanthus camelliae, which is a camellia pest, and Xylella fastidiosa, a bacterial disease. And it shows the score that we give around likelihood, impact, and value at risk. And so for Alurocanthus, it's quite a low risk. It's 12, so it's very much in the low risk category, whereas for Xylella, it's 60, so that is a red risk, it's a high risk. And that is how we manage all of our risks. And when you look at the pests that we horizon scan, there's actually over 1,200 on our risk register now, predominantly insects, but a whole range of other pests and diseases. And predominantly they are in the low risk category, below 45. But we do have a number of risks, obviously in the red category, and these are the ones that we focus on. And more emphasis is placed on those due to limited resources. So here are 3 of our most unwanted threats. Xylella, I've already mentioned, it's a bacterial disease. It can infect a very, very wide range, over 500 species. Particularly, we're concerned about tree species if it were to establish in the UK. It's present in France, Spain, Italy, now Portugal, and it's devastated olive plantations in Italy and almond plantations in Spain, as well as lots of wild plants, you know, the Mediterranean, Occitane flora, and the flora of the Balearic Islands and Corsica, Sardinia have really been devastated by this disease. So definitely one to keep out. Emerald ash borer is an exotic pest of ash. It's very widespread in North America and Canada. It's been spreading from Russia into Ukraine. So this is one that, again, is a massive threat. It's mainly regulated through wood. We've actually got strict regulations on all wood, but particularly ash from some parts of the world is prohibited. And then plain wilt, a fungal disease of the iconic London plane. It's spreading through the Canal du Midi in France. And predominantly this is spread through infected cutting tools, as well as planting material. So we've got very, very tight controls on all of these. so that we're managing the risk of it entering the UK. And then we have 3 outbreaks that we're currently dealing with. European spruce beetle. We've got an outbreak in Kent currently. The problem with this pest is it can actually fly over the channel. So those red dots there show where we've been trapping it using pheromone traps. But we're dealing with 5 separate outbreaks at the moment, felling infested ash so that we can try and get on top of it. And that's going very well at the moment. The reality is Kent is a hotspot for a whole range of pests and diseases because of its proximity to mainland Europe. So sweet chestnut blight again, we've got several outbreaks of that. They're linked to historic imports of infested sweet chestnut trees. Again, we've got very, very strong controls on those now. And then the oak precessionary moth, which was introduced into West London on an amenity tree back in around 2006. So there is a zone around London which is infested that we take action on. And those green squares are where infested oak trees were introduced through imports in recent years. But at those sites, the pest has been eradicated. So it's predominantly an issue in West London that we're dealing with. And then we've got the high profile tree diseases that I already mentioned, Phytophthora ramorum and ash dieback. And acute oak decline is another disease that we're concerned about. We're doing a lot of research on all of these, and particularly acute oak decline. It's quite fascinating. It's caused by a complex of bacteria which are new to science. They've been newly named through the researchers at Forest Research with their collaborators, and they are spread or associated with a native beetle. So it's an agrilla species. So it's quite a complex problem to understand, but we're doing a lot of monitoring on oak, particularly through our partnership, Action Oak, and again, taking action on larch to control for Phytophthora ramorum. And for ash dieback, it's all about introducing tolerant ash and regenerated ash so that ash can remain in the landscape for future generations. We do lots of border inspections to help with our work. So these are some of the sites that our inspectors have to deal with. And they're working across the whole of England and Wales. Scotland have their own inspectorate, and we're getting hundreds of thousands of consignments notified every year, and we prioritize these for inspection. So low risk material will probably have around about a 10% inspection rate. High risk material, for example, high risk hosts of Xylella like olive, that's got 100% inspection rate, as well as the material has to be quarantined and tested before it's allowed to come into the UK. We've got lots of analysis that supports our work, predominantly through ferroscience, everything from real-time PCR, barcoding, and on-site testing. We do a lot of on-site testing at the airports for notifiable pests and diseases. So there's a huge amount of science goes on behind our work. We do a lot of aerial surveillance. We fly helicopters. This is Ben Jones from the Forestry Commission with his helicopter, and they do annual flights, take images so that we can compare the health of trees from the canopy. And then increasingly, we're looking at satellite detection of stress in trees, working with a company called Resitech, which is a spin out at the Harlow Space Agency. They're helping us with species identification and also looking at stress of those trees. That helps us focus on where do we actually need to send inspectors to do the ground truthing. And again, how can we assess the changing health of the tree canopy over several years? This was useful with the recent Ips typographus outbreak, the spruce bark beetle in Kent, because we were able to compare canopies over the last several years to really try and focus on where are the trees looking stressed, where do we need to actually go in and have a closer look. And then we also have a research program for pest management. One pest that arrived in the UK in about 2015 is the Oriental Chestnut Gall Wasp, Dryacosmus curriculus. This has an impact on sweet chestnut trees. It causes galls, defoliation, and in places like Italy, where sweet chestnut is grown as a crop for its nuts, it has a massive economic impact. So we became interested in how could we manage this problem through biological control. There are native parasitoids of Dryacosmus and also non-native parasitoids. So we've been investing in research on this, being carried out by Newcastle University and collaborating with the Italians. And we identified a non-native Pteromys sinensis, has been used extensively in Italy. And this year, having obtained approvals through ACRE and done extensive risk assessments, we released Pteromys sinensis at 15 different sites in the southeast, where we've got the Oriental Chestnut Gall Wasp. So we're going to be monitoring those. FERA are doing that monitoring work for us to see if we're managing to reduce the impact that this pest is having on sweet chestnut. And then we also work with citizens, the public. Citizen science is a popular way to work through a whole range of different challenges, societal challenges. We've got a project called Observatory in partnership with Woodland Trust and Forest Research and the devolved administrations. And we've trained up 200 expert volunteers all over the UK to help us identify priority pests and diseases. We train them to identify around about 25 tree pests and diseases. And the map there shows positive and negative reports, the red ones being where there has been a positive finding. So that might be Ash Dieback, for example. And then the green ones where something was reported, the tree was looking a bit unhealthy, but actually there wasn't a pest problem. We've just agreed to fund Observatory for another 5 years. And it really is a fantastic project. And when we get an outbreak situation, we'll ask Observatory to mobilize their volunteers and start having a look nationally. And it really helps increase our surveillance capability. And we do thank our volunteers enormously for the work they do. Essentially, they're observing trees where they live and where they work. So they're the ones that see changes in those trees over time. So it's really valuable information. Anyone can also report a pest or disease or a concern about tree health through an online platform called Tree Alert. This is managed by Forest Research. And essentially you take a picture, you provide some details, you upload it, and then it will be submitted to the identification team. And then based on what you've said and what it looks like, it will be triaged, just like when you go to A&E, it will be given a priority. And then for high priority reports, we will send somebody to actually have a look and do some ground truthing, find out what's really going on the ground. So again, Tree Alert's really valuable. I think we had around about 5,000 reports last year. So again, this is something that we think is really valuable, and it gets the public involved. If you're seeing trees on your daily walk, then you can tell us what you think is going on, and then we can investigate. And then we also have a range of public campaigns to share information about plant health. Last year was International Year of Plant Health. We had all sorts of things planned, which obviously didn't happen in person, but we did a lot of social media work promoting International Year of Plant Health. We had a National Plant Health Week. We had that last year in September, and this year we had it in May. And we also launched Izzy the Inspector, which is an activity booklet. You can download Izzy, And we made a little video of Izzy as well. This is to get children, schools involved in understanding that, you know, plants and trees get sick too, and to sort of help them understand the value of those plants and trees and what we're doing to protect them. We've launched a standard for horticultural nurseries, Plant Healthy. This is a biosecurity standard. This is so that, you know, if you're a member of the public and you want to buy responsibly, you know, you can look for the Plant Healthy standard at your garden centre. And then we also have campaigns, Don't Risk It, which is about not bringing back plant material from your holidays, not that you're necessarily going overseas on holiday at the moment, but it's obviously an important message for the future. And then keep it clean when you're out and about, walking in woods, you know, clean your boots, don't spread pests and diseases through boots and buggies and so on. Finally, all this information is available on the UK Plant Health Information Portal. We post everything there, and you know, that's the sort of first point of call. You can also access the UK Plant Health Risk Register there. And also to look out for, in September, we're going to be launching a consultation on a new plant biosecurity strategy. So if you're interested, please have a look at that and comment. And we'll also be asking for views on whether we should have more tree quarantining when trees are imported into the UK. So something for you all to have a look at there. Our strategies are also available publicly. Our plant biosecurity strategy, our tree health resilience strategy. And then obviously once we finish the consultation and we've considered, we'll be launching a new plant biosecurity strategy next year. And then all of our work also sits under the government's 25-year environment plan. And then finally, I'm on Twitter @PlantChief. So please give me a follow if you're interested in finding out more. But otherwise, thank you very much for your attention. And I will stop sharing. Shall I stop sharing, Padma?
No, it's fine.
Oh, okay, I
okay.
did.
It's fine. Thank you, Nicola. That was riveting. Love the story of the headboard. And to be honest, I never thought of all these ways that pests can, I mean, borders mean nothing to them, to be honest. And of course, there's man-made trade, and we are actually bringing them across. But one thing was, I'm South Asian, of course, and I love curry leaves.
Yeah.
So that picture of curry leaves.
Yeah, well, when we were in the EU, curry leaves were banned because there's a virus disease called citrus greening, which can be spread in curry leaves and then get onto citrus production in Europe. So we had to ban them from the UK to be part of EU law. But actually, of course, we don't have a citrus industry. So it was really quite difficult, and particularly the demand from the South Asian population was high. Similarly, we banned mango. I don't know if you remember the mango ban.
Yeah.
That was difficult. Similarly, we banned mangoes because we were in the EU and they were a risk to fruit production, but it wasn't really a threat to the UK in the same way. So I'm glad to say that we no longer ban mangoes or curry leaves or a whole range of other fruit and vegetables that don't really present a risk to the UK. So, you know, we do regulate things, but we can also deregulate where we think that the risk is not there.
Yeah, and of course, it's very important to have that kind of flexibility and fluidity as things change. We have questions from the audience, so I'm just going to move on to the question.
Okay.
Somebody.
Sorry, I've put some of you off your lunch.
Yeah, somebody I think was it was the Beetle story.
Yeah.
Okay, so somebody called IJE, I don't know what the full name is, has asked, I'm a gardener and have several clients with ash dieback. What should I be advising them?
So ash dieback is very evident at the moment. And what's interesting is you'll see, you know, some trees with different levels of sort of canopy. The very severely affected ones, you know, have lost a lot of leaf canopy. But then you will also see trees that have got very good canopy. So it's quite variable. Our advice is, unless the tree is representing a risk, if it's near a road or a railway or somewhere where it could cause a sort of public health risk, then leave it alone, because it still has a lot of benefits. Ash supports around about 1,000 species, 45 of which are obligate on ash. So it's an important species for biodiversity. And, unless it's actually representing a problem, a health and safety problem, leave it. And, there will be different degrees of it, being affected or being tolerant. We know that we've got around about between 5 and 10% of our ash trees are probably tolerant. And those are the ones that are doing well, and they're setting seed and regenerating. So an ash dieback infected tree isn't really presenting a risk anymore because it's so widespread. So leave it alone, and unless it becomes a problem, because it will still provide a habitat for lots of species. And of course, even if it dies, it's dead wood as well, isn't it? That provides an important habitat for insects and fungi. There's a lot of advice about managing ash dieback if you're a landowner. We work closely with the road and rail networks and local authorities, because for them it's a different kind of problem, where ash might become a danger in a public space or on the rail or road network. So you can have a look for the ash dieback management toolkit that's available at the Tree Council website. That gives really good advice. And also the Forestry Commission website gives really good advice about dealing with ash dieback.
I'm going to ask related ash dieback questions that has popped in before I move on to the other ones. Elaine is asking, are there any indications of resistance emerging in the UK vis-a-vis ash dieback?
So, the story there is very interesting. So UK scientists sequenced the ash genome a few years ago, and there's a lot of work going on, particularly Richard Buggs at Kew. He's working on genetic markers for tolerance in ash. So we know that there is tolerance. He's trying to understand the kind of genetic basis for that. And working with the Future Trees Trust, we screened 165,000 ash seedlings across East Anglia in several trials, and we've selected the material that survived, and the Future Trees Trust are continuing to monitor that and select tolerant material, which could become part of a future breeding program. The other work that Richard's doing is to look at resistance to emerald ash borer, because we want, if we're going to select for tolerance to ash dieback, we also want that material to have tolerance or resistance to emerald ash borer. So we're working closely with the Canadian Forest Service. They've had a lot of experience with this. So I think there's some, there are some positives about ash dieback in that we've now got a really good scientific understanding of the disease, of the genetics of the tree. And so that gives us the opportunity to develop tolerant or resistant varieties for the future. We've seen elm making a comeback through resistant elm varieties, which people are now replanting. So I think, as ever, science and observation is such an important part of managing these problems, which are, widespread in the environment.
Yeah, it's funny that the last lecture we had was by an author who wrote on the Wardian case, and the box that transported plants all over the world in the Victorian era. Yeah, absolutely. And now we're in the 21st century, but we still have the same problems.
We do, yeah.
There's an interesting question from Amelia Lewis. She's wondering about the situation with aquatic pond plants. She says that Elodia was banned for sale as it's invasive, but it seems to have been replaced by Asian oxygenator species such as Rotunda, which are known weeds in rice paddy fields. How safe is it buying aquatic species from local garden centers?
I think that's a very topical question. We work closely with the Aquatic Plants sort of trade associations, because obviously several aquatic plants are invasive species. The regulation of invasive aquatic species is a bit more complex. There is a list of invasive species that are regulated, but we're trying to kind of gather evidence around some of these other plants, because it's a question of under what situations might it become an invasive species, and that's quite a complex question to ask. But so there's a lot of work going on within DEFRA and our research partners to look at this. And again, working with the trade, because none of them, want to be knowingly selling something that is invasive or might represent a risk. But sometimes things do make their way in, and particularly internet trade is a challenge here. People think that because they can buy it on the internet, it must be okay. But we work closely with the online sales platforms to try and take down anything that is actually prohibited or regulated. But it's a constant challenge to sort of catch up with that. And particularly, we're doing more work on invasive plant species because the economic and environmental damage that they do, again, can be huge.
Question here from Alex. How accurate is remote sensing in detecting disease, especially considering that trees with dieback might have a healthy canopy, as you mentioned?
Yes, so we're trying to use the data that we have, both from the helicopter flights and photographs, and also the satellite data through kind of machine learning to try and develop tools which are much more accurate. So at the moment, it does involve sending somebody to actually look at the tree on the ground to kind of add that expert dimension. I think in time, this is something that we'll get much better at and will become much more efficient at. I think it's early days. We also use Sentinel plants, which means that we deliberately plant vulnerable species near points of entry, ports, airports, and we will, also add things like pheromone traps, because that's where we think it's more likely that things will enter. And so if we see symptoms there first, then that's something that we can monitor regularly. In fact, the IPS outbreaks that we found in Kent were through exactly that monitoring system. We have baited, pheromone baited log piles at particularly sort of vulnerable places, and that's where we go and look, and sure enough, that's often where we'll find things. They've come in, they've been attracted to the Sentinel plant or the pheromone trap, and that's where we can catch them. And we know there's a problem, and then we can do the wider surveillance to see how widespread the problem is. So, the answer is we're getting better at it all the time. Investing in technology, investing in science is really helping us get a much better feel for, what the situation is.
Yeah, the pheromone baiting is really interesting, and it's such a good trick to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we use pheromone traps at the Asian Longhorn beetle outbreak site in Kent. We monitored that site for 5 years after we felled 2,000 trees to get on top of it, but we couldn't declare the site eradicated until we'd had 5 years of negative trap data. So again, it's really helpful to mop up any residual insects at the end of an outbreak. We use pheromone traps for oak precessionary moth monitoring as well, so that we can look out for any more breeding populations. So very, very helpful for us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And also to know how much is going on behind the scenes to protect the trees.
Yeah, absolutely.
Elodie asks, how many inspectors are working to answer the reports on tree alert? How do you manage it? Is it physical inspection on each one of them, or is it picture diagnosis?
So the people that work on tree alert, there's a small team of half a dozen or so, and they're not inspectors actually, they're scientists. These are scientists at Forest Research. So they receive the alert, and then we've got people who are entomologists, pathologists. They will look at the photograph initially and to look at the situation as well. And then they may be able to provide a diagnosis based on that. Or they may say, actually, we want to have a closer look, and then they, will send a team in to go and have a look on the ground. We've just equipped Forest Research with a mobile lab in a van, which we've been using this year. And it's a white van, which is equipped with laminar flow, microscopes, PCR, whole load of sampling and testing capability, as well as it's a kind of sheltered place for them to work. So they can go out and have a look at things on the ground, and, pick up anything new or anything different. So it's a combination of the images that are uploaded and then the kind of physical inspection if we think it's something where we need to investigate more closely. We've had 1 or 2 sweet chestnut blight reports through Tree Alert, which have led us to new findings, because that's quite distinctive. It's a bright orange fungus that grows on the tree trunk. And so, my colleagues who are very experienced at sort of spotting these things will presume that it's probably sweet chestnut blight. But in order to take action, we've got to verify that. We actually have to go and take a sample, has to be verified in our reference laboratory, because there has to be a legal basis for us then having a statutory plant health notice and taking action.
Alan Hildrew asked, is the EU justified in putting up barriers to UK goods if we are now importing risky pests from elsewhere? That's risky to them.
Well, that's a very interesting question, and it's quite a challenge for us at the moment. So the situation is, since we left the EU now prohibit all high-risk plants as they're described. There's a list of high-risk plants, including tree species, that they prohibit from all third countries. So the UK is now, well, the GB, so Northern Ireland is excluded from this because it's still part of the single market. GB trees are prohibited from entering the EU. We believe that this is not proportionate. We're actually submitting dossiers to the European Food Safety Agency, EFSA, because there is a route by which plant risk can be assessed. And we hope that the EU will consider our applications. I think there's about 35 plant species that are prohibited. And we're going to be asking the EU to look at our risk assessments and then make a legal basis and a technical basis on whether it is correct that those plants should be prohibited. Similarly, seed potatoes have been prohibited, even though Scottish seed potatoes are the best in the world. And are meeting the highest plant health and marketing standards globally. They're prohibited. So again, we've been making the case to the EU to ask them to consider authorizing the export of the plants and seed potatoes to the EU in the future. So we will see what happens over the next few months, years.
David Ruddock is asking, is there any evidence regarding the interplay between pests, diseases, and climate change? I guess, is it making it worse?
Yeah.
Is it making them proliferate?
Yeah, absolutely. No, we think, climate change is a really important driver. Whenever we do a pest risk assessment for our risk register, we always do Climex modeling. So the pest risk analysts in my team will model future climate scenarios, because it will affect things like how long the breeding cycle might take, the epidemiology of the pest, how far north could it go, for example, how many years would it take to complete its life cycle. We do see changes in pest biology where they can complete more than one life cycle a year, for example, where we're seeing them much further north than we might expect previously. So climate change is a massive factor globally. If it's affecting how a pest is responding in another part of the world, then that could have an impact on us. There might be a higher level of infestation in an imported product that we would need to check and therefore modify our regulations. So it's something that is of great concern to all of us.
There's a long question from Mariana Toma. She's a horticultural engineer in Romania, and she's loved your presentation and says thank you. And she's interested in disease and pest monitoring program in her country. She's asking if there's any specialized consultancy or a program she can download even with payment to get more information regarding natural predators of pests and the biological approach, as well as identification of stressed and low immunity plants.
Okay. I think there are several sources of information here. If you have a look at the plant health portal that I mentioned, but also look at forest research, because that's got a pests and diseases section, and it's got really good profiles on forestry pests and diseases. And then it gives a huge amount of information. But on the risk register, if you can search it for a particular pest or a particular host, and it will give you very detailed information about, the pest, the research that's been going on, how it could be controlled and that kind of thing. So those are probably the first places to look. It's totally open, it's downloadable, it's searchable. We love it when people in other parts of the world use it, because I think it is quite a useful resource. And then also, I think you said she was from Romania. Yeah, so again, looking at what EFSA are doing at an EU level, I think will be useful.
Right.
European Food Safety Agency.
Yeah, I'll just take a couple of more questions because there's a lot here, but I'll just see the different ones. Kate Long asks, is there as much work completed in tree replacement programs of resistant species as there is detection?
Well, I think the answer is it's improving. I think for a long time, this was quite a neglected area, but we've now got a lot of investment in tree research, so we've got a lot better tools. So I work closely with the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research, BIFOR, at the University of Birmingham. They've got a massive research program looking at tree health. Forest Research are doing that. Several universities are doing lots of work on tree health. The research councils are funding work. They've just announced 6 new projects on the Treescapes program. We're funding work through the Bacterial Plant Diseases BBSRC program. So I think it's an area that's actually very exciting at the moment. Lots of people who've never worked on trees are now quite engaged, but it's hard. If you're used to working on Arabidopsis or wheat, where you've got lots of tools and lots of prior knowledge, it is challenging. But thankfully our universities and institutes are really putting in a huge amount of effort training new scientists and early career researchers. So I think it's a really exciting time for tree health.
And one last question, Nicola, sorry if I'm keeping you. Alice asks if any plant pests have been included in plant simulation models such as aquacrop or tree equivalents.
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I suggest you ask Google. Sorry about that.
No problem. In that case, Nigel Cooper asks, he read an article in Arborate, I don't know, where the argument was that the GB should prohibit imports as we are in more danger than our exports. Is there any comment?
Well, we do prohibit a lot of imports. So we recently introduced much stronger controls for hosts of Xylella, but we take a risk-based approach. We don't just prohibit everything. We prohibit things where we think the risk is too high and it can't be mitigated. But for other high-risk materials, we will require a whole range of additional declarations that have to come with the phytosanitary certificate. So everything now comes with a phytosanitary certificate if it's regulated. And for example, for olive, we require that it must come from a pest-free area. It must have been tested or quarantined. And then on arrival, we've got 100% inspections. So we apply very rigorous controls to high-risk material. We prohibit sometimes. So for example, ACER is completely prohibited from many countries, including Asian countries, because of the risk of longhorn beetles. So, you know, we will use the risk register to identify, you know, what is the appropriate proportional action to take. And sometimes that is prohibition.
Right. Thank you so much, Nicola. I'll definitely be looking at trees in my neighborhood and reporting.
Yes, look out.
Yeah, but thank you for such an informative and entertaining talk. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, and all of you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.